Hi, I'm Sarah Tantillo. I'm the Managing Director of Humanities at Great Oaks Legacy Charter Schools Network. Today I'm going to be presenting on using grammar to improve writing. So let's get right into it. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So first I'm going to ask you to take a moment, and you can press pause to answer this question. What is most challenging for you about teaching grammar and writing? You could probably come up with at least 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 things. It's pretty challenging. Take a moment and then we'll come back. Okay, we are back. So I want to talk about, first of all, before we get started, why grammar matters no matter what you teach. So whether you teach English, social studies, science, anything where students are writing, informative, argumentative, creative, any kind of writing, grammar is really important. If you think about grammar as the containers that contain meaning, for many of our students, it's like they're trying to carry soup, and all they can show us is they know carrots. These containers of meaning, these sentences that they're writing, are not carrying enough. And so part of what we want to try to do here today is to give you some strategies and some tools so that you can strengthen your grammar and writing instruction to support students so that they do what all good writers do, which is to write one good sentence after another. So that's what we're up to today. Okay. This workshop is based on things from my website, my blog, and particularly from my book of the same title. And I've also pulled some things from my previous other 2 books. So let's take a look at the agenda. As I mentioned, I work at Great Oaks Legacy Charter School Network, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we teach writing at Great Oaks. And then we'll get into what to stop doing, and then some key principles for effective grammar and writing instruction, and a few other things as you can read here. All right, so let's get into it. So we have basically a 3-step approach to how we teach writing at Great Oaks Legacy Charter School Network. First, we want to quickly sort and assess exit tickets, which we use virtually every day, or some recent writing, to determine any potential grammar or writing needs. Then we will use that data to design a writing mini lesson that targets those needs. And we're going to talk about how to do that effectively with a proficient exemplar and a not yet proficient exemplar. And then students would revise, and they might revise independently. They might revise with something we call the partner feedback protocol, which I'll explain in a bit, or through writing conferences. And again, I'm going to explain all of this. So let's talk about what we should stop doing, because in order to do what's right, you also need to stop doing things that don't work. One thing you want to, and let me just go backwards and just say this. I will say some things that will probably annoy you, and hopefully I will say at least one thing that will make you happy. If you're feeling annoyed because I'm telling you to stop doing something that you've been doing for a while, I just want you to try to take it in, think it through, and try to trust me, and see if you can make it work. So the first thing we need to stop doing is we need to stop making students copy down rules or definitions first. Let me clarify. Notice it says first. I'm not saying you can never have students record rules or definitions of grammatical points, but you shouldn't start there because it takes away all the mystery, all the suspense, and it goes in one ear, out the other. It's just not sticky. So don't start with the rules or definitions. If you're using daily oral language, we don't use this at Great Oaks, but if you are using it, please stop. There are at least 16 reasons why this approach is ineffective. If you're not familiar with it, it looks like this, where you give students a sentence that has a bunch of different random mistakes, and they're supposed to correct them. A couple key problems with this. It's not really instruction. It's practicing applying lessons that you should have had, and some people unfortunately use it in the place of instruction. And so kids who already knew the grammar rules can get it right, and the kids who didn't get the grammar instruction previously just can't fix mistakes when they don't recognize them. And there is zero research to support this program in terms of improving students' writing. They do not transfer anything from this into their own writing, because I think one reason certainly is that it's somebody else's crappy sentence and they maybe can fix it and maybe can't. It's not going to transfer into their own writing. So we're going to talk about what to do instead. You can have students do revision and editing, certainly, but you have to also provide instruction in anticipation of that. So even if you wanted to do this idea of a sentence approach, it would be better to use 2 sentences, have students compare them, and discuss which one is more effective. In this case, I have a very targeted grammar point that I'm trying to make here. I'm not putting a million different errors into a sentence and asking students to find them like a bunch of Easter eggs. There is really just one grammar point I'm trying to make here. So if you read these 2 sentences, running home, he tripped on his shoelaces, versus he tripped on his shoelaces running home, which one is more effective? I hope you notice that the first one is more effective because the modifier running home is modifying he. In the case of the second example, the modifier is misplaced. And so it sounds like the shoelaces are doing the running. So this would be a grammar point around modifiers and where they're supposed to be placed. And students could learn from this example. Okay, next thing we want to stop doing is we need to stop drilling. What do I mean by that? Circle every adverb. Compare that to write a sentence using an adverb and explain how it functions in the sentence. If you can do the second one, I know you can really use adverbs effectively. If you are just circling words that you think are adverbs, but you're not really sure, that's not really going to translate into more effective writing. Now, here's the one that I think you're going to really like. Stop over-editing student work. All right, I can't tell you how many days, weeks, months, really years of my life that I lost to over-editing student work. I taught high school English for 14 years, and pretty much every weekend when I was teaching, I would spend hours and hours marking up student papers, and I got really good at copy editing, but my students didn't, because I did all the work. So we'll talk about what to do differently going forward, okay? And so let's get into the 7 principles and what to do. So the first thing you want to do is treat students like detectives. All right, here's an example. Instead of giving students the definition of a pronoun and saying, hey, we're going to talk about pronouns today, here's the definition of a pronoun. Instead, give them these 2 columns and say, I want you to compare these 2 columns and see what is similar and what's different. What do you notice? Take a moment, talk to your neighbor. If you can do that in person, do a turn and talk quickly. If not, if you're doing online instruction, you can have them type into the chat space things that they're observing, and they could respond to one another that way if you do a public chat. And hopefully what they will start to notice is that there is a pattern that is repeated from column A to column B, and that him is replacing John, her is replacing Shayna, them is replacing Christine and Rochelle, it is replacing basketball. Okay, so they can articulate that, and then you start to explain further once they have figured that out. So treating them like detectives gets them really much more engaged in the material. And then you can talk about how literally pronoun means for noun. So it's standing in for a noun. Him is standing in for the proper noun John, for example. Okay. Second key principle is we have to explain why this lesson matters. So you can't just say it's Tuesday, so we're doing pronouns, because that's not going to motivate anybody. If you are able to take a look at my website, On the RPM objectives page, you will find more information there. And also in my book, Using Grammar to Improve Writing, there's a whole section on pages 19 and 20 about scripting the pitch. In the case of, so what I mean by RPM objectives is rigorous, purposeful, measurable objectives. And here's an example from that little mini lesson that we just looked at. Students will be able to explain how pronouns work in order to, there's the purpose, use them effectively in their writing. And then you want to get into, this is what good writers do, right? So you want to invest every lesson with a sense of purpose, the why of what we're doing. Make the pitch so that students feel like there's something in it for them. Third key principle, as I call it, is to ask, what do you like about that sentence? As I said earlier, good writers write one good sentence after another. So it's going to be really important that students really appreciate that concept. Now, if you've already seen my module on argument versus evidence, you may want to skip the next couple of minutes while I walk through this little mini lesson on what I like to call the inside of the desk paragraph. But if you haven't, stay with me, or you can fast forward if you like. So the way I normally use this is for a variety of purposes. One, we're trying to identify the argument, the topic sentence of this body paragraph. And so we start there, and then we're going to build on that knowledge base and start to look at the effective choices that the writer made. So let's go through it. So we're going to read the first few sentences because we know that the argument, the topic sentence, the argument sentence is going to be in the probably among the first few sentences, 99% of the time. And so we're looking for a sentence that includes arguable or debatable language. So we read, I usually have pick a student to read it one sentence at a time. So let's pretend the student reads the first sentence. It's true. What's true? I don't even know what they're talking about. I do know this is a body paragraph, so I'm assuming that the it's true is actually referring back to something that was stated in a previous paragraph. So I would actually mark this sentence as a transitional sentence. Let's read the next sentence and see if we notice any language that is arguable or debatable. Okay, so you probably noticed that there are some debatable words in here like typical, difficult, organized, clean. And so right off the bat, this is a possibility as the argument for this paragraph. And so what we want to do next is read the next paragraph and see if it seems to support that sentence. So here we go. There's never enough room for all the textbooks, workbooks, independent reading books, binders, and notebooks, much less the pens, pencils, and erasers. I would ask, does that sentence seem to support the previous one? Thumbs up if you think so, thumbs down if you don't. Let students vote on that. Okay, great, it does seem to support it. Now I have another question, and this gets more into the notion of writing instruction and teachable moments. So my question is, why did the writer not just simply say, there's never enough room for all of their stuff, period? So I would say, press pause for a moment. If you're near somebody, or if you're in a breakout room with somebody, press pause and talk to somebody about this question, and then come back. Okay, so if you had a chance to think about it, what you probably noticed is that there's a lot of visual support here. You can actually see the actual detailed items that are inside the desk. The stuff is kind of vague. Somebody noticed one time, it's kind of like the sentence is enacting the overstuffedness of the desk. It's kind of overstuffed with words, all those things. I know the writer, that's what she was going for. Okay, so we'll keep reading. Plus, and I would here interrupt the students to say, hold on a second. Ooh, interesting transition. Notice how the person didn't just say first, second, third. Okay, plus is an interesting transition, so we'll mark that. Let's keep reading. Because students are normally not permitted to leave their seats during class, it is tempting to use the desk as a personal trash can. Now, another teachable moment here. If I took out the word plus, this sentence would start with because. For some people, they're like, oh my God, a sentence that starts with because. How many people watching this were probably taught never start a sentence with because? If you raised your hand, I apologize to you on behalf of the entire educational infrastructure. Not only is it wrong to tell students not to start a sentence with because, it's really damaging to their writing. Let me explain why. As I said, I taught high school English for a long time, and I would often get students who had been taught don't start a sentence with because, and they suffered from what I like to call the because problem. And here's what I mean by that. If I said, I like pizza because it has cheese on it, you would understand how I feel about cheese, right? If I said pizza has cheese on it because I like it, that doesn't really make sense. Pizza has cheese on it because that's the recipe for pizza. So what happens with students who've been taught to not start with because is they kind of get all pretzel-y in their logic, and they aren't sure how to use the word because correctly. And that then kind of inhibits their ability to reason and explain things effectively. So we want to make sure that they know that they can and should start sentences with because. All right. So, all right. Now, before I read the last sentence, I'm going to ask you to think about what you like about this sentence. Now, I'm not fishing for compliments, but as I read it, just think about that. Here we go. Crumpled paper, used tissues, bent paper clips, and loose pencil shavings need a place to go, and the desk makes a convenient hiding spot. Take a moment, press pause, and write down at least 3 things that you like about that sentence. And then we'll come back. Okay, we're back. So you may have noticed the adjectives that are transforming the nouns. Crumpled, right? Paper isn't trash until it's crumpled. Tissues aren't trash until they're used, etc. You may have noticed that there's some personification, that all these objects need a place to go. You may have noticed the strong vocabulary, convenient hiding spot. You may have noticed the punchy ending. It doesn't just end with, this shows how difficult it is to make a desk. Okay, so if you have students who write in a way where they end up with repeating what they said in the beginning, if you give them that formula, they will follow that formula and they will write really boring stuff. And by stuff, I mean another word that I'm not going to say. And it's your own damn fault if their writing is boring and robotic, because that's what you're putting in front of them. You can put this kind of writing in front of them and they can imitate this. So think about it. When have you ever heard somebody say, what do you like about that sentence? If you haven't ever heard that or haven't ever asked your students that, I strongly encourage you to start doing that today. What do you like about that sentence? Implies that there is something that you should admire about it. It implies that sentences are important and should be done well. And that, again, good writers write one good sentence after another. So all of these fold into that principle of asking, what do you like about that sentence? All right, let's keep going. So it's important to give faster feedback, right? So I think historically, a lot of English teachers in the past, or any really teachers of any subject, assign something and then they like put in a folder, and it takes them a couple of weeks to get back to students with this stuff that's graded. At that point, students don't even remember what they wrote. All they're looking for is what's the number or the letter on top of it? How did I do? And meanwhile, you spent all this time marking it up and they don't pay any attention to your feedback. So instead of doing that, we're talking about really strengthening their writing by giving them much faster feedback. So the next day after you wrote an exit ticket, we're going to do a mini lesson on how you wrote. And so let's start there. So with the whole class mini lesson, if you want to introduce a grammar point, it's a good idea to start off with 2 proficient exemplars, all right, that can be compared. So like the pronouns example, both of those sentences in column A, all the sentences in column A and column B were proficient sentences. but there was something different about them. And the students had to figure out what was different in order to understand the grammar point. So when we say comparing two proficient exemplars, that's what we're talking about. All right. And then students have to figure out how that grammar point works and why it's important. And then you can give them some more sentences to apply this point to. And they can write their own sentences or paragraphs using this skill. So that's one approach. All right. You can take a moment right now, and I'm going to ask you to press pause. If you have a copy of my Using Grammar book, you can find a grammar point that you want to introduce and create a PowerPoint slide to show students. It has to include something that they need to figure out. So essentially what you're going to do is you're going to go through, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second, and I'm going to show you this chart. On my website, there is this page called Using Grammar to Improve Writing. And there is this K-12 selected language tracker. All throughout my book, I go over how to teach, how to introduce, teach, and assess every single one of the K-12 language standards. So if you wanted to say, go to 3rd grade and talk about using coordinating and subordinating conjunctions as a grammar point, you would look at the page where I describe how to do that and get some ideas, and then you would put together a PowerPoint on that. If you just want to find the tracker, though, you can find it as a free download on my website. And of course, if you're watching this from Great Oaks, it will be in the PD shared drive. Okay, let's go back to our slides. Press pause, take a moment to do that now to make your PowerPoint for some practice. Okay, now we're back and we're looking at another approach to mini lessons. This is, I've read through all the student exit tickets and I noticed a common thing that they all need to work on. In this case, I'm going to show a proficient exemplar and some not yet proficient examples. And then I'm going to ask students, what is different and what will we have to do differently to make the weaker examples stronger? How would they solve this problem? And I could give them additional solutions, more examples, and then get them to reflect on their own writing and just target that one skill. So if you want to practice now and press pause, if you have a pile of student writing, sort the writing, into proficient and not yet proficient examples. If you don't have any proficient examples from the students, you're going to have to make sure you've written your own so that you have a model to start with. Because if they can't compare, they really don't know what the goal is. And then figure out the most high leverage grammar or writing skill to teach. Again, take a look at the tracker to figure it out, or look in the Using Grammar book. Okay, now we're going to move on to writing conferences. So first you have to stipulate, what is the focus? You're not doing a writing conference to talk about every single thing that is in their writing. Let's pretend they wrote an essay and you want to give them some feedback. You don't want to give them feedback on the entire essay. You want to look for something particular. So establish up front what you're looking for. So for example, we've already discussed our introductions. Now I'm looking for your topic sentences in your body paragraph. So please underline those before we meet so I can know what you think your topic sentences are, and I can give you some quick feedback on that. I bring students up in groups of 3 or 4. If we're in person, they would be sitting near me. If we're doing this online, I would ask a TA or a fellow or some other adult to stay in the main session of Zoom, and we would go into a breakout room, just me and the 4 students. And then I would start with one student at a time, sharing the screen where they can see what the student wrote, and starting with praise. So I have to find something that I like. If you can't find anything really specific, you should start off with saying, I like what you're trying to do here. And don't say it in a snarky way, but genuinely, I like what you're trying to do here. And then I have some questions. So you want to ask questions. Can you clarify what you meant by blah, blah, blah? Can you elaborate? Can you explain? So you're not judging, you're not critiquing. You are not grading at this point. You are trying to ask questions so that students can figure out the answers and get stronger as writers. And what will happen while you're talking about one student's paper is that the others will do what I call academic eavesdropping. And I saw this with my own eyes when we were doing online instruction a couple months ago. I could see students leaning forward to look at the screen to read the other student's work as the teacher was talking through it. And the same thing happens if you're doing this in person. They start listening to what you're giving in terms of feedback to the other student, and then they start working on their own paper with that same issue in mind. So with the first student, you want to set a goal. Okay, I need you to work on da, 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 and then I'm going to talk to the next person. And then I'm going to come back to you when you're ready. It's kind of like, you know, when you're in the post office and they say, just step to the side, tape this down, and when you're ready, I'll take you. You don't have to get to the end of the line. So the student who you just gave feedback to is very motivated to get their stuff done because they know they're going to be able to move through the process and get out of your hair pretty quickly. The third thing we do is called the partner feedback protocol. And the way this works, it's really important to model this before you try to have students do this. I would model it with a student, and then I would let the class practice. And then I would ask them what was challenging about doing this. So let me explain how it works. So essentially, you have two people sitting side by side. One person is looking at the other person's screen or paper while the author is reading it out loud. And they read it out loud all the way through first. Generally, I find that, you know, you just kind of got to get the whole thing out first. And I would suggest that you don't do this for a whole essay, but just like read a paragraph and then read it again. The second time they read it, they should be reading it more slowly. And the person who is reading alongside them silently should tap 2 times if they want to give some feedback. And the feedback will take 3 different approaches. One is asking a question. Can you clarify? Can you clarify what you meant in that sentence? Or can you please say more about that? Or they might give some praise. I like the way you use that strong vocabulary there, whatever it is. When they give that feedback, the writer will make a marginal note. They'll insert a comment. They're not going to fix it if it's a question. They're not going to answer it out loud to the other person. This is not a negotiation. And the temptation here is if the listener is a strong student, they want to like, here, let me tell you what to do. We don't want them to do that. We just want them to ask the questions. And then the student will make a note and they'll go back and they'll address those questions. If they're stuck, they can always come to you for a writing conference. You know, this person asked me to elaborate here. I'm not really sure how much more to say, what to say. Can you help me with that? And then we can have a writing conference about that. But that should be between the teacher and the student, not between 2 students. We don't want students fixing other students' writing. It's often like the blind leading the blind. So we don't want that to happen. Okay, next key principle is to celebrate success. So I like to use show call, especially to praise excellent student work on exit tickets from the previous day. So, you know, yesterday, Javon did a great job on his exit ticket. I'm going to put it up. Let's take a look at it. And let's give Javon some feedback on what he did really effectively in this exit ticket. What do you notice? If we're doing this online, type into the chat some things you noticed that Javon did really well. Great. 6th principle is to provide oral support. So we want to stress to students that they should be using formal language when they're in class. When they're talking to their friends, family members, anybody outside of school, if it's an informal setting, they can use informal language. But we need to practice formal language so that when they're in situations where they need to use formal language, that they are practiced and able to do it. So if you put these 2 things side by side and have students read the first column and the second column, they can see the difference, they can hear the difference, and it starts to stick a lot more effectively than if you just correct things in the moment, because those things don't stick. This is actually research-based. I did a lot of research on this for my book, and this particular example is right out of the research. Okay. Last key principle is model, model, model. It's really important that when you want students to use effective grammar and writing, that you put effective models in front of them so that they can see what is done well. And they can contrast that with what they may have on their page and make adjustments. Okay, so for practice, you could press pause right now, go to the tracker, find a standard that you want to teach, and make a pitch for how you're going to teach it, why is it important, and think about the first few minutes of the mini lesson. So I'm going to ask you to press pause, and then we'll come back for a couple of more quick things. Okay, last couple of quick things. I'm not going to get into all of these right now, but I will just say, when you look at students who are not on grade level, which is going to be many of our students for a variety of reasons, grammar really has not been effectively taught for, I would say, decades, if ever. And so students are not going to be on grade level. You have to figure out where they are. And it's okay and even really necessary to go backwards before you go forwards. You can't just stay in the 7th grade grammar standards if they haven't mastered the 3rd grade ones. So you have to go backwards, and then you can start to go forwards. Start small, start really, really specific, and then keep track of the progress. And last but really not least, make sure everybody's reading grade level texts. And with support, if they're reading grade level text, they're going to see grade level syntax and grammar, which is going to be grade level appropriate. And so then they'll have to wrestle with the challenges grammatically that they find there. And they can imitate grade level text as well. There are a bunch of other factors that affect how well we write. In my book, I talk about the most important writing standard, which is really to ask and answer the 5 W's and H questions. Talk about genre, audience, and tone. Talk about argument and evidence, the challenge of concluding, and how to combat learned helplessness. So these are all addressed in my book, Using Grammar to Improve Writing, and I will address them in subsequent video modules as well. But I just want to give you a heads up to pay attention to those. Take a moment, please, and write down your key takeaways. And if you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.